Hi everyone. Myself Prakhar Rawal. I am currently a PhD student at University of Turku, Finland. I'm studying bird communities in wetlands, both in India and in Finland. And prior to this, I have done my master's in wildlife science at Amity University in Noida. And so I will be presenting some of the work that I have been doing in the past almost 3 years now on different aspects of bird communities in Delhi. And so, yeah, I just begin. We know the human population has been increasing over the past 100 years or so, or even more. And especially during the last 70, 80 years, there has been a rapid increase in human population. And along with that, there has also been a rapid rise in the urban population with people migrating from rural areas to urban areas. This has led to increase in size of cities, increase in the number of cities, and change of the rural landscape into a more urbanized landscape. So as we can see, the urban population crossed the rural population around the year 2008. So we have more people living in the urban areas. And along with the urbanization, of course, there is a transformation in land. The landscape completely changes from a natural wooded forest or any kind of natural landscape into a more human-dominated landscape, like a built-up area, buildings, farmlands, and areas for grazing. Even though right now still we have a majority of the human modified area is a cropland area and agricultural area, but there over the past 100 years or so, since 1700, there has been a change of almost 5,000% in the built up area, with the number of cities increasing, not just in India, but worldwide. And most of these urban areas, especially populated urban areas, are concentrated in uh, the Asian and the Southeast, the Asian areas and African areas, but majorly India and China, where we have most of the mega cities and the large cities, largely populated cities. So conservation of wildlife in these areas is a real big challenge in today's world. And as we can see that despite this urbanization concentration in the Asian countries, the most of the studies which have happened on urban ecology have come from Europe and US, the North American continent. So there is a lack of studies, even though the number of studies have been rising. The Asian countries still represent a small fraction of the total research that has been going on in the urban landscapes of Asia. So what challenges do birds face in particular, which I will be talking about today in these landscapes? So one of the major challenges, of course, in not just in urban areas, is the habitat loss. They find it difficult to locate suitable areas for them to breed, feed, and spend their time. Habitat fragmentation, of course, even though these big cities retain some of these large uh, some urban patches, some natural forest patches or wetland patches, they are fragmented and are in between. There are huge areas which are just buildings, and it is difficult for them to move across these landscapes. Then the next is the non-native vegetation, because there is a large amount of exotic vegetation being planted to beautify the city. We see that the natural vegetation is being lost, and along with the loss of this natural vegetation, we also lose those intricate ecological interactions which the species which reside here share with these uh, with these species which have built up over millions of years. Then along with the non-native vegetation, there is the problem of homogeneous vegetation. So since there's almost a monoculture of the species that are planted, so this causes even further lack of diverse habitats for birds, not just birds, but any kind of biodiversity. And then there is an increase in predation, because we have many more feral animals like cats, dogs, and overpopulation of some of the uh, some selected predator species, which causes much more chances of predation for these natural species, for these native species. And yes, like I mentioned, the change in interactions, like in urban areas, you will see these feeding grounds, and you will see uh, people uh, the dump yards, like for example in Delhi, the famous dump yard for kites. So the entire behavior of these species changes in urban areas, and there is a long held consensus. Sorry, there's a long held consensus that urban areas support much fewer biodiversity when it comes to the natural or even agricultural areas. So there are many different kinds of efforts which are put into conserving biodiversity in these urban areas. So uh, some, especially in the European cities, not so much in the Asian cities. Like even we have these elements are not necessarily put for biodiversity, but the major steps which people take is to first conserve some remnant woodland habitats, uh, conserving wetlands, small wetlands, large wetlands. Then, of course, urban parks are one of the elements which are majorly planted for recreational purposes, but they also are now well known to support and support biodiversity, in particular birds, and help them in many different ways. Next is home gardens, which is especially in the European and North American countries where they have lawns and have they plant trees and different kind of plants in their home gardens, which can also be a major uh, which can also support biodiversity, especially if there are home gardens in large numbers. Then green roof is much of a modern thing which has been attempted, and there are fewer studies on how much biodiversity these can support. But this is especially useful in cities where there is there's a lack of space to create more natural natural green spaces. And finally, street trees. So street trees are abundant. They're planted all around almost every city, and they can also support biodiversity, as has been shown in the past decade or so. So in this today's presentation, I will majorly be talking about wetlands and street trees, which has been my focus over the past 3 years. So first, I would like to talk about wetlands. So this is a study which I conducted during my master's initially, and then now I am carrying it on, continuing it on it during my PhD as well. So this was this is this is a picture of my master's dissertation, and it was conducted at Amity University, funded by Nature Conservation Foundation, and my supervisors were Dr. Murali Krishna, Dr. Gopi Sundar, and Dr. Swati. So for just a general introduction of Delhi, Delhi, as we know, is the capital, but it is also one of the most populated cities in the world. The population has been rising, and it is projected, especially the national capital region, is projected to become the most populous urban amalgamation anywhere in the world by 2030. But at this rate, it might be earlier. And as we can see that over since 1977, there has been a increase in the urban area of Delhi. There is still some agricultural area, but which remains majorly on the outskirts of northwest and south west Delhi. But largely, it has been completely transformed into a urban hub. Speaking of the birds of Delhi, there has been a collection of historic checklists, and also there have been relatively higher number of studies conducted in Delhi among the urban areas in India. And uh, we know that there are around 400 species of birds, or maybe even more species of birds. Over 400 species of birds have been recorded in Delhi over this period. But the studies on wetlands in particular have focused on some of the more prominent larger wetlands, like the floodplains of Okla Bird Sanctuary or the Najafgarh Drain, and some of these prominent wetlands, or they have focused on individual species like the nesting of painted stork. So they have focused on the nesting of specific species. But prior to this study that I conducted during my master's, there were no studies at all on the value of the small remnant wetlands which are remaining in Delhi, since Delhi was originally an amalgamation of small villages. So most of these villages had these small ponds, and they still continue to be in the city, even though they are much more degraded now. They still continue to remain in large numbers. So there were no studies to understand how much biodiversity the bird diversity these ponds are supporting. Also, these ponds in the recent times have been shown everywhere in the world, like in different places in the world, that a good network of small ponds can support a create a high landscape level diversity of birds. So with this in mind, we set out to ask two simple questions. How much avian biodiversity can these small ponds retain? And secondly, what are the habitat variables which drive these bird communities to use these small wetlands? So I'm using the word ponds and wetlands interchangeably, but ponds is basically I have defined here as a wetland which is smaller than 5 hectares, which was in my study. But uh, yeah, so in Delhi, first we had to. There was no clear. There was no map available of the entire city of Delhi and the ponds or the wetlands in general. So we had to prepare a map from the scratch, and we located around a total of 574 wetlands, which included majorly almost 70% of them were smaller than 1 hectare. So these are the small ponds that I was talking about. The total wetlands cover an area of about 871 hectares, and these wetlands include recreational wetlands, these remnant village ponds, agricultural wetlands, uh, which were specifically constructed for the purpose of irrigation. Then there's industrial waste disposal wetlands, which are now maybe before they held some other role, but which are now used as dumping sites for the wastewater generated in industries. And then there are accidentally flooded wetlands, which are also surprisingly in a high number. These are just uh, pits or areas where just rainwater or wastewater has collected and they have become significant wetlands. So for this study, I stratified the map into grids and then classified these grids based on the amount of wetland which was present in the grid. And this stratification was used to select the site. So there were total of 39 wetlands which I selected, 13 from each category of 0 to 5 hectares of wetlands, 5 to 10 hectares, and more than 10 hectares of wetlands. So just to give you a glimpse of what these wetlands look like. So as you can see that this is a recreational wetland which is near the old fort of Delhi. Then this is also a recreational wetland which is more on the outskirts of northwest Delhi. These are old remnant wetlands. This in particular I think is from Tughlakabad near fort, which the last time I recently visited, it is not there anymore. But then there are these are the overflooded wetlands which I was talking about. There's some industrial work, there is some construction work going on, and due to this large pit and over collection from the nearby drain, it has converted into a wetland. And this last one is a industrial wastewater dumping wetland, which is now just being used as the disposal of waste water. So this study surveys were conducted between January to March of 2020 before it was cut short because of the pandemic. But I conducted both morning and evening surveys and I visited each wetland once and spent nearly over 4 hours every day and observed all the birds that were visiting these ponds. I also collected information on different habitat characteristics of these wetlands, like the shoreline characteristic, the vegetation that was present there, how much was the waste disposal there, and what was the water quality like. So how much biodiversity do these ponds retain? So this was the first question that we wanted to address. And surprisingly, we found these ponds to be supporting an disproportionately high amount of biodiversity. So these wetlands, you can see here that what the wetland cover of Delhi is only a very small fraction of the total area of Delhi, the land use of Delhi. And from these ponds that I sampled, these 39 sampled ponds represented less than 0.0001% of the total area of Delhi. But they were supporting almost over 30% of the species that have been recorded in Delhi. And when projected using estimates, they are supporting. So there was total, we almost saw 120. I recorded 127 species, but the projected estimate is around 180 species. So this is a very, very high number for these very small wetlands, which most of them were very highly degraded as well. And this is at that time, I'm not sure after that if somebody has done other studies elsewhere, but at that time this was the highest number of species recorded in a tropical in a mega city anywhere, in a citywide assessment of the bird diversity at ponds. So this was a really interesting and incredible result for us. And so if I just tell you about the kind of birds that were present, so if we classify the birds based on their feeding gills, carnivores, insectivores, and omnivores were the major feeding gills that were represented. And if I classify them based on the habitat, then the shoreline vegetation, the birds which were using the surrounding shoreline of the wetlands were in highest number, followed by waders. So as you can see, birds like divers like grapes, surface birds like gulls, shoreline birds like shrikes and bulbuls, and waders. A huge area of waders was observed, not just tails and ruffs, but also goldwits and sandpipers and so on. And wagtails and the aerial feeders like the swallows. And based on the feeding gills, the green-footed pigeon, and of course, like I mentioned, the bulbuls, the granivores like sparrows and avian and piscivorous birds like the cormorants, the Indian cormorant, the little cormorant, and the greater cormorant. Duck species like spot-billed ducks and even mallards and garganys. And of course, this huge diversity of birds was observed. So which birds dominated these ponds? So the maximum, so this is the out of 39, how many ponds did I observe these birds? So of course, rock pigeon, the most popular bird in any urban area, was on the top, but tied with it, closely with it, was the common resident wader of India, the black-winged stilt, which was also observed at equal number of ponds, along with the red water lapwing. So this was good that these ponds are still able to support these waders in particular, which require the shoreline and this shallow amount of water. So which have more specific requirements than the rock pigeon. So these were also present in high numbers. And of course, the white-throated kingfisher was there, the crows, the citrine wagtail, the common manna, the Eurasian moorhen, which is another common wetland bird. And among the other wetland birds, the Indian spot-billed duck and the green sandpiper were among the other birds, wetland birds that I observed. And there were also 6 species which are of global conservation concern. So among these, the common pochard is the one which is the common pochard is the one which is vulnerable, while the rest of them are near threatened species. So 6 species of conservation concern were also observed. And next question we wanted to ask was what actually drives these bird communities at these pond sites. So size of the pond, so the green represents the higher, the green represent positive relations and red represent the negative relations. And so the pond size was associated with higher diversity. The larger the ponds, the higher the number of birds. But the important variables which I find very critical for the management of these ponds are the shoreline diversity. So this defines the diverse amount of habitats which were present around the wetlands. So like if I show you here, so I recorded 5 different kind of shoreline features. This included the concrete, if it was concrete, the trees, the shrubs, the open area, and the emergent vegetation. So the idea was to divide them based on their proportion and then see how much diverse was the shoreline. So increasing the shoreline diversity not only increased the diversity of the birds, but also the bird numbers. So this is a very significant variable for the management and conservation of these ponds. The next was island feature. So this is a interesting variables that I collected, which was the presence of an island-like feature. So island-like feature doesn't necessarily mean though the the cliche island that you're imagining in your head, but this could be any feature on which the bird can rest within the circumference of the pond. So this could be a natural island like this, but it could also be any artificial feature or any rock which is there in the middle of the pond, which is there in the middle of these wetlands. So this allows these birds to be away from the shoreline where most of the disturbance happens. So if these island-like features are there, the birds are more likely to visit these ponds. And then, then there was also the management intervention. So the current management interventions, particularly in India, are focused on making these ponds more accessible to people, to more accessible to humans, making it more recreational friendly. So these kind of planting trees around them, and so these kind of management interventions are in this study we found them to have a negative effect because most of them cause more disturbance. They concretize the the shoreline of the wetlands, making them less suitable habitat for birds. So yeah, so these were the variables which we found, and then there were definitely specific associations with certain birds, like the certain functional gills and certain birds. So these can be read in details in the paper. I will share details about later. So what does this all mean for conservation? So in developing countries like India, biodiversity conservation can definitely take a back seat because priorities are elsewhere, and particularly in urban areas where there's already a consensus that urban areas don't support birds. But these remnant wetlands habits, small wetlands, this study shows that these can also create a great network for birds to move, to stay. And this study in particular, I forgot to mention, but this is conducted during the winter season when we have the highest number of migrant birds. So these birds are coming from a long distance and they want to find these small habitats where they can take a break. So even these small wetlands, even though they are in urban areas, they want to use them because this is their migratory pathway. So having these wetlands not only is important for our own bird diversity, but also of these of these migrant birds that we are hosting in India. So these small wetlands offer an incredible opportunity for conservation because firstly, they're easy to manage. As you can see, I have shown that here that even slight modification to the shorelines, adding some small features like islands or any artificial feature can greatly increase the bird diversity. So these are very small efforts which we can make to support a huge amount of biodiversity. They don't require change of landscape, creating new ponds, but these small wetlands are a very prominent feature of the entire Indian landscape, not only Delhi, because of our climate and the monsoon seasons that we have. These wetlands have been created throughout the country, known by different names, but these wetlands are a prominent feature. And just with a few management interventions, which are aimed at biodiversity, can greatly increase the bird diversity they can support even in urban areas. So this study sheds a new light at looking at these degraded wetland habitats in urban areas, and I hope this can create more management actions at these ponds, because in the latest master plan of Delhi, which was released in last year, I think later in the year after the study was published, they have talked about conserving these wetlands, and thankfully these are being conserved, but there is no mention of biodiversity in the whole plan. So there is still a gap in understanding that these ponds are capable of supporting biodiversity as well, and not just our recreational features. So if anybody wants to read this work, this work has already been published, and you can find the links, or you can write to me and ask for these papers. So next I want to talk about is street trees. So this is the next study which I carried out after my completion of this the ponds work, and so this was done in collaboration with and supervision of Dr. Ghazala ma'am and Dipali, who was a student at Met University. This was also part of this study, was also used for her master's dissertation. So now changing the gear completely and moving to street trees. So street trees, like I mentioned, they are a very abundant feature of any city. There is much more research, like there are much more studies on street trees compared to small ponds, but not significantly more, and particularly in India, they are still very much lacking. Street trees but it has been shown that they are capable of reducing the negative effects of urbanization. Birds use them for nesting, they can use them for perching, they can use them for movement, and they also use them for feeding. So, but these birds show preference of these different trees based on the features of the trees, which has been shown in other countries. And understanding these features can help us better plan and better manage these urban landscape and better planting of these trees. So when I speak of Delhi, so this Delhi's urban the street trees in Delhi were originally planted. The plan was created by Sir Edwin Landseer Lutyens, after which the Lutyens area of Delhi is named. This was created nearly 100 years ago. But this is, the plan was basically to plant very large trees with tall, straight trunks and which have huge canopies. And they were planted with a very well thought out maps with one lane having only one species and the other lane having other species, and they consist of very good selection of indigenous species of trees like the neem, arjun, the jambua, the jadi, imli, and rest of the species. But this is only focused on the Lutyens part of Delhi, which is, as we know, is a very small area in Delhi. But the rest of Delhi is the trees are either those which are remaining from a long period of time or those which have been planted by the DDA. And these also include some indigenous species, but they are a huge diversity of species, and they are planted based on the area they are being planted in. So there's a huge diversity in that. So the study on this is one of the best studies which has been conducted in Delhi, which is a city-wide study conducted by N.K. Tiwari and A.J. Urfi. So they Urfi sir and Tiwari sir conducted this study in which they did repeated surveys for 2 years, I think between 2012 and 2014, and they divided the entire city into small grids, and they surveyed every grid to understand the occupancy of these birds. And they found that, of course, areas which have more green habitat support, there were more chances of a bird being present there. And they conducted this for many different species, including particularly many of the woodland species. And they've created these grids of 2.5 kilometer by 2.5 kilometer. And if anybody wants to read the study in details, you can go further. But what is missing from these kind of studies is that the studies on these show us that yes, we should conserve green areas, but the planting and management requires very, very micro scale level knowledge, like which tree species to plant, because the green spaces can also vary greatly in the urban landscape. One green space could be just palm trees and one green space could be people trees. So they can support very different kind of bird diversity. So human decisions are made at very final scale. So these studies are very important, but we also need to even make our scales even more finer so that we can make more management oriented decisions. So with this motivation, we set out to understand that what are the tree scale and local scale level variables which affect the bird visitation of these street trees. And we chose 3 different urban landscapes of Delhi, which have support very different kind of, which are very different kind of urbanization. And we focused on figs. So we focus on figs because they are keystone food resources. It is well known that in the tropical landscape, ficus species are the keystone resources, and not just in natural areas, but also in urban areas. They have huge size. They are asynchronous fruiting patterns. So not all of them fruit at the same time. So they fruit at different times. Same species can fruit throughout the year in different times. So this provides resources to birds I will mention birds, but birds in particular throughout the year. And they have very short intervals between fruiting. So these are very critical resources in the landscape. And given the constraints during that time, because this study was conducted in late 2020, so there were always constraints due to the COVID. So we wanted to focus on a species which allowed us to have many trees which were fruiting. So it was easier to find fruiting fig trees than for other species. And they are also very common street trees in Delhi. So nearly, in our study site, nearly 10% of the street trees were ficus species. So the variables we wanted to study were the height of the tree, the canopy of the tree, the identity of the fig species, and the local variables like the human disturbance, the noise levels. Then the local fruiting and flowering. So how many trees in that area were fruiting and flowering in the very local neighborhood of that tree. The green cover, which is present in 200 meter to understand if these isolated trees which are away from, which are in a very urbanized area, are they also supporting, are they also attracting birds? And the site, which was the three sites, which I will just discuss briefly in the next slide. And in the season, because the study started in the winter season and then it carried on to the spring season. Excuse me, just a second. So these were the three sites we selected. So one was Lutyens, which I already described at the start, which is very urbanized. As you can see that it is a very, very green landscape compared to others. And it has these avenues, which are almost straight lines, which are very, very green because of the broad canopy trees, which are present here. The second was Greater Kailash, which has these large green patches, which is the horse grass and the couple of other parts which are there. But overall, it does not have such a high intensity of street trees as compared to Lutyens. And finally, the third area was a peri-urban area, which is a completely unorganized area of different urban and rural elements, which is the Chhatarpur area, which is in the south of Delhi. It has these farmhouses, which are open green spaces, and then there are trees, and then there are even agricultural areas. So it is a very mishmash of a type of urbanization. So these three areas were selected, and we focused on three species of figs, which was the Ficus bengalensis, the banyan tree, the Ficus religiosa, which is the peepal tree, and the Ficus virens, which is the pilkan tree. So these grids, which are 6 by 6 kilometers, were drawn out, and then we selected trees based on whenever we could find a fruiting tree. So the study was carried out from October 2020 to April 2021. Like I mentioned, the survey, first we carried out a vegetation survey. So we wanted to see how much of these figs are there so that it could help us select which fig trees to sample. And based on that, we found a banyan, peepal, and pilkan to be the most dominant ficus species which were planted in these areas in particular. And based on that, we selected these species, and then we surveyed them of 10-minute surveys in the morning 3 times. And we recorded all the species that were visiting there, the number of those species that were visiting there. A total of 106 species trees were sampled across the landscape. And now let's talk about the bird diversity that was observed. So we observed a total of 29 species of birds, and this included 7 obligate frugivores, so which are primarily dependent on their diet on fruits. These species ranged from the rose-winged parakeet, the pigeon, warbler, tailor bird, hornbill, tree pie, barbets, white-eye, and quail. And so these are just few. And the most abundant and in the species which was observed at the highest number of trees was, of course, common mena, which is one of the most dominant species in the urban landscape, along with the crow and pigeon. But among the frugivore, the yellow-footed green pigeon was found to be the most abundant, while the brown-headed barbet was observed at the maximum number of trees. So usually the yellow-footed green pigeon was present in large numbers. So on a single tree, there would be 10 to 20 individuals sitting together. So they had the highest abundance, while barbet would be 1 or 2 barbets, so mostly 1 barbet. So it was observed in a much more number of trees. So how were they different across these sites and the species? So surprisingly, Lutyens, which is the most dominant, which is dominated by street trees, showed the lowest abundance of species. So I would like to mention here that it does not mean that the abundance of birds in that area is low. It means that fewer individuals were visiting these individual trees because and we believe that it is because there's such a high number of trees that the birds are not bound to congregate on these single individual trees, which are critical, providing these critical resources. And the highest abundance and diversity was observed on the peepal tree, the Ficus religiosa. We believe that it is because of the small size of the fruit. So I would also like to mention that it also had the highest diversity of birds that was observed. So I calculated the Shannon diversity index of the species that were visiting. So it also had the highest diversity. So it is likely because among these three species we selected has the smallest size of the fruit, and it makes it easier for birds to consume it of different sizes. And then it is also known, it has also been studied in a prior study that it also has the highest nutritional richness compared to the other two species. So it could be a very attractive fruit for birds. And what if variables were affecting? So we found, like I mentioned, that luteins had the lowest species, and greater Kailash, which had the highest species of birds. Uh, and the canopy diameter was found to be the critical factor when it came to abundance of birds. So larger canopy attracted higher number of birds because it definitely provided it has a higher canopy, means it also has more fruits, and it also provides better protection from predator, allowing birds to feed on fruits without the threat of predator as much as in a tree with a smaller canopy. Then the resource tree density was found to be, so the resource tree density is the earlier that I mentioned, the amount of fruiting and flowering trees in the 50-meter diameter. So this was found, so the more the resources in the local landscape, the fewer birds on the trees. So again, we believe that it is because if there are more resources in the small neighborhood, the birds don't congregate on singular trees and they spread out more. But yes, of course, we need to conduct studies which parallelly studies like Dr. Ulfi's and Dr. Tiwari's, where they have done this grid level, and then to also parallelly study the tree level to understand how these patterns go about. Is it better to have more fruiting trees in a small areas, or is it better to spread them out? So parallel studies are needed in the future to get a better, clearer picture of the distributions. And when it comes to very specific species, so different species are affected by different variables. So, but yeah, the two important points I would like to focus on here is the frugivores, which need more fruits during the breeding season, and the breeding season coincided with the season we marked in our study. So the change we estimated around February end, where we changed it to spring. So more frugivores were observed feeding after February, which is also most of the species breeding period. So it is important that these species get the resources when they need it the most during their breeding season. Also, the green cover had effect on certain species, but the most important thing is that it had a negative effect. We did not find green cover to have a significant effect on most of the species, including the frugivores, although there was a very weak correlation. So, but this is important that to understand that despite this green cover being low, it does not have a strong effect. So birds are able to locate these trees even in a urbanized area and isolated trees. But yeah, it had a negative effect on the rock pigeon. So this is very interesting. And also the fruiting and flowering had also a negative effect. So there is this need. It has not yet gone full force in India, but in countries like Singapore, where they're trying to control the number of rock pigeons. So having more fruiting trees, which are attractive for the urban birds, the native urban birds, could be beneficial in indirectly controlling and managing the population of species like rock pigeon and the house crows, which could dominate and control, and which could have an negative effect on the other species. And surprisingly, we did not find any effect of noise, of just on one species, which was jungle parrot, but overall species did not get affected by noise, which was a very interesting result. That even in very very human dominated areas and human disturbed areas, birds continue to visit these important fruiting resources. So again, what does this mean for conservation? So We know that figs are among the most popular street trees in Delhi. They're easy to grow, they're hardy, they can last long years, and they are also native and natural to Delhi. So they are a very good choice for street trees. They attract high diversity of birds, are keystone resources. And again, other than this is a strategy which can be used to improve the biodiversity of birds in Delhi. And not only are they attractive for their fruits, but they also were attractive for insectivorous birds like warblers. So further studies need to be conducted to know what is the insect mass which is present probably at these trees, and do figs actually support more insects as well. And these trees important other thing we found that was the canopy size. So these trees should be allowed to grow to large sizes, should be allowed to grow their canopy to the maximum amount so that they can keep attracting a high amount of birds. And like I mentioned, that future studies should study both the micro scale patterns and these coarser scale patterns, to we can understand more in details, and we can unlock these patterns more in detail to make better management decisions. So this study has already also been published. If anybody wants to read, this is a open access article, so you can directly access it on the website. And I would like to acknowledge all these people who were present in this project, and if anybody has questions, please.
Yeah, if you have questions, just unmute yourself, or just put your questions in the chat box. Any questions? Yeah, so I don't think that there's any questions right now yet. So
Okay.
yeah, thanks for attending. Thanks everyone for attending.
Yeah. And I would just
The
like to drop my mail address in the chat if anybody wants
sure.
to contact me. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm also putting the YouTube link through, so please do subscribe. The recording should be out by tomorrow. Yep. So thanks again for attending, and really nice work, Prakhar.
And I would like to thank Think Wildlife Foundation for giving me this opportunity to present my work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.